From the moment I entered the airport, an uneasy feeling clung to me. The bustling terminal was alive with activity. Families reuniting, business people rushing to catch flights, and children dragging colorful suitcases. Yet, amid all this life and movement, I felt disconnected, as if I were watching everything through a pane of glass. The fluorescent lights overhead buzzed faintly, casting a cold, sterile glow that seemed to seep into my skin. I adjusted my bag on my shoulder and tried to breathe deeply, but my chest felt tight, constricted. It wasn't just the usual anxiety of flying. It was something deeper, more visceral, like an invisible hand pressing against my heart. My eyes darted around, catching glimpses of people's faces. They seemed blurred, distant, almost unreal. I noticed a man in a suit pacing back and forth, talking into his phone, his voice a sharp, urgent whisper. Nearby, a little girl clung to her mother's leg, staring wide-eyed at the vast airport hall with a mixture of curiosity and fear. Everyone was preoccupied with their own lives, their own worries, and yet I felt an overwhelming sense of dread, as if some unseen force had singled me out. My stomach churned with nausea, not the kind you get from hunger or illness, but something more profound, an instinct, a primal warning that I shouldn't be here. I tried to push these thoughts aside as I approached the check-in counter. "It's just anxiety," I murmured under my breath, as if saying it out loud would make it true. My hands trembled slightly as I handed my passport to the attendant, who smiled warmly, oblivious to the storm brewing inside me. As I made my way through security, my mind raced. I went over every detail of my trip, double-checking my ticket, confirming my seat, even checking the flight status one last time on my phone. All was in order, yet I couldn't shake the feeling that something terrible was about to happen. While waiting to board, I tried to distract myself by watching the other passengers. A middle-aged woman with a floral scarf was leafing through a travel magazine. A young couple whispered excitedly, heads close together, sharing a set of earbuds. Near the window, an elderly man in a worn brown coat stared out at the tarmac, his face a mask of quiet contemplation. Everyone seemed so ordinary, and yet the sense of foreboding gnawed at me, growing stronger with every passing minute. The boarding announcement came over the PA system, a crackling voice that made me jump. I swallowed hard, clutching my boarding pass. As I walked toward the gate, the feeling of unease tightened like a noose around my chest. I felt the weight of invisible eyes on me, as if someone, or something, was watching. I hesitated for a moment, glancing back at the terminal behind me. For a fleeting second, I considered turning around, abandoning the flight altogether. But where would I go? What excuse would I give? I shook my head, trying to clear away the irrational fear that had settled in my mind. "It's just a flight," I whispered to myself. "Just another flight." I joined the line of passengers boarding the plane, each step forward feeling like it was taking me closer to some invisible threshold. The narrow jet bridge felt like a tunnel, its walls closing in on me with every step. The hum of the engines outside was louder now, a low, menacing growl that seemed to resonate in my bones. I felt a sudden chill, as if the temperature had dropped a few degrees. When I finally stepped onto the plane, the sensation only intensified. The air inside was warm and heavy, tinged with the faint, acrid smell of jet fuel and something else, something metallic, like the scent of old blood. I tried to steady my breathing, forcing myself to smile at the flight attendant who greeted me. Her eyes were bright, her smile polite, but there was a flicker of something in her gaze, something almost like pity. I made my way down the narrow aisle, avoiding eye contact with the other passengers. The seats were already filling up, families with children, solo travelers, a man in a business suit typing furiously on his laptop. I found my seat near the middle of the plane and slid into it, trying to ignore the gnawing discomfort in my gut. The woman next to me, the one with the young daughter, gave me a polite smile. Her daughter was perched on the window seat, clutching a ragged stuffed bunny in her tiny hands. She looked up at me with big, curious eyes, and I tried to smile back, but my lips felt stiff, uncooperative. "First time flying?" the woman asked, her voice warm and friendly, with a hint of an accent I couldn't quite place. I nodded, though it wasn't true. I had flown many times before, but never with this kind of dread weighing down my soul. The engines roared to life, and the plane began to taxi down the runway. I gripped the armrest, my knuckles turning white. I closed my eyes and took a deep breath, willing my racing heart to slow down. "It's just anxiety," I repeated in my mind, a silent mantra against the rising tide of fear. The woman beside me leaned closer.
"Don't worry,"
she whispered.
"Everything will be fine."
Her words were meant to be reassuring, but they had the opposite effect. They felt hollow, almost mocking, as if she knew something I didn't. The plane accelerated, the runway blurred beneath us, and with a shuddering lurch, we were airborne. I felt my stomach drop and my heart pounded in my chest like a war drum. I glanced out the window, watching the ground fall away, the world shrinking beneath us. The unease grew stronger. I felt trapped, as if the very air around me had become a cage. I glanced at the woman and her daughter again. They seemed so serene, so untouched by the fear that gripped me. I wondered how they could be so calm. As the plane leveled off, I closed my eyes, hoping to find some small measure of peace in sleep. My body was exhausted, drained from the constant tension, and despite everything, I felt myself slipping into unconsciousness. But even in sleep, there was no escape from the darkness that loomed over me. Sleep came reluctantly, like a thick, oppressive fog settling over my mind. Even as I drifted off, I could feel my body tense, every muscle coiled and ready for something. What, I didn't know. In the darkness behind my closed eyes, images flickered like a broken film reel, flashes of lightning, twisting metal, faces contorted in terror. I could hear a distant, rhythmic thumping, a heartbeat maybe, or something mechanical, something insidious. The dream, or whatever it was, deepened. I found myself standing in a narrow hallway, its walls stretching infinitely in either direction. The ground beneath my feet was soft, like walking on a thick carpet, but every step felt heavy, as if I was sinking into the earth. The air was thick with a fog that smelled of smoke and something else, something faintly sweet, like rotting fruit. I turned around looking for an exit, but there was nothing, just endless, dimly lit space. Panic began to claw at my throat. My heart raced, and I could feel the cold sweat trickling down my spine. I moved forward, each step echoing in the emptiness around me. My footsteps grew louder, more frantic, until they were drowned out by a deafening roar, a sound that seemed to come from everywhere at once. I jolted awake, my heart pounding against my ribs. For a moment I couldn't remember where I was. The dream clung to me like a shroud, the images still vivid in my mind. I took a deep breath, trying to steady myself. I could feel the vibrations of the engines through my seat, a constant low hum that felt almost like a pulse. I glanced around, disoriented. The cabin lights were dim, casting long shadows on the walls. Most of the passengers were asleep or lost in their own thoughts. The woman next to me was whispering softly to her daughter, who had fallen asleep with her head resting against the window. I tried to find comfort in their presence, but the uneasy feeling was still there, stronger than ever. Then it started. At first, it was just a slight tremor, barely noticeable. I thought it might be my imagination, a lingering effect of the nightmare. But then, the tremor grew into a shudder, and the plane seemed to lurch sideways as if something had hit it from below. My stomach flipped, and I gripped the armrest tighter. The overhead lights flickered, and the intercom crackled to life. A calm, measured voice spoke.
Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain speaking. We are experiencing some unexpected turbulence. Please remain seated with your seatbelts fastened. We will keep you updated.
Turbulence. That's all it was, I told myself. Just turbulence. I'd been through turbulence before, but this was different. The plane shuddered again, more violently this time, and I could hear the rattling of the overhead bins, the clatter of loose objects in the galley. I looked around, trying to gauge the other passengers' reactions. Some looked concerned, gripping their armrests, while others seemed oblivious, lost in their own worlds. The woman beside me gave me a reassuring smile, but her eyes betrayed a hint of fear. The plane began to rock, first gently, then with increasing intensity. The seatbelt sign blinked on with a ding, and the cabin crew moved quickly down the aisle, checking to ensure everyone was seated and strapped in. I could feel the tension in the air, a collective unease spreading through the cabin like an invisible wave. I closed my eyes again, trying to block out the noise, the vibrations, the unsettling feeling that something was terribly wrong. But the noises grew louder, the groan of the plane's metal frame, the soft, frightened murmurs of passengers, and somewhere in the background, a low, steady beeping sound. Then, a loud, thunderous crack echoed through the cabin, followed by a sudden, violent jolt that sent the plane veering sideways. My eyes snapped open, and I saw a flash of lightning outside the window, illuminating the dark clouds that surrounded us. I could hear gasps, screams, and the unmistakable sound of something breaking. The plane dropped suddenly, as if it had fallen off a cliff. My stomach leapt into my throat, and I felt weightless for a brief, terrifying moment. People screamed, a chorus of fear that filled the cabin. The woman next to me clutched her daughter tightly, her face pale, her lips moving in silent prayer. The plane steadied for a moment, but the relief was short-lived. Another jolt, more violent this time, shook the cabin. The overhead bins flew open and bags tumbled out, hitting passengers and the aisle floor with heavy thuds. A baby cried out somewhere behind me, its wail piercing through the chaos. The intercom crackled again, but this time the voice was less steady, tinged with an edge of panic. Ladies and gentlemen, please remain calm and stay in your seats. We are encountering severe turbulence, attempting to... The rest of the announcement was lost in another deafening roar, this time a sound that I recognized instantly, the sound of engines failing. My heart pounded wildly, and I felt my breathing quicken, shallow and rapid. I glanced at the window, where I saw flashes of lightning and thick, swirling clouds, but nothing that made sense. And then it happened. The moment when everything went from bad to catastrophic. A sound like tearing metal filled the air, a high-pitched scream that cut through the cabin. The plane shuddered violently, throwing people against their seatbelts. The oxygen masks dropped from the ceiling with a hiss, dangling like lifelines in a storm. The cabin lights flickered again, then went out completely, plunging us into near darkness. I could hear frantic cries, the sound of people fumbling for the masks, the click and snap as they pulled them over their faces. My own hands shook as I grabbed the mask in front of me, struggling to breathe through the plastic tube. The plane lurched again, harder this time, and I felt a sudden, sickening drop. I was pressed back into my seat as the plane pitched downward. I heard the unmistakable sound of metal tearing, like the skin of the plane was being peeled away by giant hands. The sound grew louder, more frantic, and I could see pieces of the interior beginning to break free, panels from the ceiling, bits of luggage, anything not secured flying through the air like deadly missiles. The screams grew louder, more desperate. I turned to the woman beside me, her face contorted in terror, her arms wrapped around her daughter. I tried to speak, to say something, anything, but my voice was lost in the cacophony. I felt the plane begin to spin, a slow, terrifying roll that pressed me sideways against my seat. The force was immense, pulling at my limbs, threatening to tear me apart. I gripped the armrest so hard my knuckles went white, my nails digging into the fabric. I could hear the wind howling outside, a banshee wail that filled the cabin. The lights flickered back on, but it was a cruel mockery of normalcy. I saw the woman next to me mouthing words I couldn't hear, her eyes wide with terror. Her daughter was crying, her small hands gripping her mother's arm. A few rows ahead, a man was frantically trying to unbuckle his seatbelt, his face a mask of panic. Another violent jolt, and the plane seemed to split in two. I heard the gut-wrenching sound of metal tearing apart, and I knew in that instant that the fuselage was breaking open. Cold air rushed in, and I felt a sudden, overwhelming pressure, as if my body was being squeezed by an invisible hand. I looked out the window and saw the night sky, vast and empty, filled with debris and falling bodies. The earth below was a dark, formless mass, rushing up to meet us. I tried to scream, but no sound came out. The plane was spinning faster now, a deadly spiral that pulled everything loose into the void. I turned to the woman beside me, reaching out instinctively, but in that instant the fuselage ripped open beside her, and she and her daughter were sucked out, vanishing into the darkness with a horrifying swiftness. The scream that escaped my lips was raw and primal, but it was swallowed by the wind and the roar of the engines failing. All around me, chaos reigned. Passengers were being ripped from their seats, disappearing into the gaping hole that had opened in the side of the plane. The floor seemed to vanish beneath my feet, and I could feel the icy wind biting at my skin, pulling me toward the void. I clung to the armrest with all the strength I could muster, but it was futile. The force was too great, too relentless. My fingers slipped, and I felt myself being lifted, weightless, into the air. For a moment I floated, suspended in the chaos, everything around me moving in slow motion. I saw the faces of the other passengers, frozen in terror, their eyes wide and mouths open in silent screams. I saw the debris spinning around us, seats, bags, pieces of the plane, all caught in the same deadly dance. And then, with a final sickening lurch, I was sucked out into the night sky. The freezing air hit me like a wall, knocking the breath from my lungs. The roar of the wind was deafening, a relentless, howling scream that filled my ears and drowned out every other sound. I tumbled through the air, weightless, disoriented, spinning wildly in the dark void. My heart pounded so hard it felt like it might burst through my chest. For a moment, I was overwhelmed by the sensation of falling, the ground rushing up toward me, an impossibly fast blur of color and light. I fought to breathe, each gulp of air freezing my throat, my lungs burning with the cold. My mind was a whirlwind of panic, struggling to process what was happening. The plane was a shattered carcass above me, pieces of it scattered across the sky, mingling with the debris of the torn fuselage. I could see bodies tumbling through the air like rag dolls, arms and legs flailing, mouths open in silent screams. The world was a nightmare of chaos and destruction. Then, in the midst of the spinning and tumbling, I felt a strange stillness. My body seemed to hang in the air for a moment, suspended in the vast emptiness of the sky. The sensation was almost peaceful, a fleeting second of calm in the middle of an unimaginable storm. But the calm was deceptive, cruel. My mind screamed that I was still falling, still plummeting towards certain death. I twisted in the air, trying to see the ground below, but it was lost in the darkness, hidden beneath a thick blanket of clouds. I knew that I was high, impossibly high, and that the ground was rushing up toward me at a speed I couldn't comprehend. The cold wind whipped around me, biting at my skin, tearing at my clothes. I felt my body start to numb, the sensation slipping away from my fingers and toes, spreading like ice through my limbs. I fought to stay conscious, to keep my eyes open, but the cold was relentless, seeping into my bones. Then in the midst of the terror, a thought surfaced, a single clear thought that cut through the chaos. This is it. This is how I die. And in that moment, a strange calm settled over me. The panic ebbed away, replaced by a cold, detached clarity. I was going to die. There was no escaping it, no denying it. The realization was both terrifying and strangely liberating. I felt a sense of acceptance wash over me, a resignation to the inevitable. I closed my eyes, bracing for the impact, waiting for the moment when everything would end. The roar of the wind grew louder, drowning out every other sound, until it was the only thing I could hear. The cold seeped deeper into my skin, my bones, until I felt nothing at all. I opened my eyes one last time, looking up at the vast, endless sky above me, the stars scattered like shards of broken glass. And then, darkness. When I hit the ground, I felt nothing. No pain, no impact, just an eerie, weightless sensation, like floating in water. I expected to wake up in agony, every bone in my body shattered, but instead there was nothing. Just a strange, hollow emptiness. I opened my eyes, expecting darkness, but was instead greeted by an expanse of light, soft and golden, like the first light of dawn. I lay there for a moment, confused, trying to make sense of what had happened. I could feel the ground beneath me, solid and cool against my back, but I felt no pain, no discomfort. My body felt light, almost insubstantial, like I was a shadow or a whisper of myself. Slowly, I sat up, my movements feeling strangely fluid, almost effortless. I looked around, blinking against the soft light, trying to take in my surroundings. I was in a field, a vast, open space stretching out in every direction. The grass was tall and swayed gently in the breeze, a sea of green beneath the endless sky. The sky was a clear, vibrant blue with wisps of white clouds drifting lazily across it. There was no sign of the storm, no sign of the plane or the chaos that had surrounded me just moments ago. The air was warm and carried the faint scent of flowers, something sweet and familiar. I stood up slowly, almost hesitantly, as if testing the ground beneath me. It felt solid enough, but there was something off, something that didn't quite feel real. I took a few steps, feeling the grass brush against my legs, soft and gentle, almost like a caress. As I walked, I felt a growing sense of confusion. How had I survived? Where was I? Why was everything so calm? I turned around, searching for any sign of the crash, any sign of the plane, but there was nothing, just the field, stretching out to the horizon. Then, in the distance, I saw it, the smoke, a thin, dark plume rising into the clear blue sky, twisting and curling like a snake. My heart began to race again, and I felt a rush of adrenaline surge through me. Without thinking, I started to run toward the smoke, my feet pounding against the soft earth. The closer I got, the more details I could make out. The jagged shapes of debris scattered across the field, the charred remains of what looked like parts of the plane's fuselage. The air grew heavier, the sweet scent replaced by something acrid, something that burned my throat and stung my eyes. When I reached the crash site, I stopped dead in my tracks. My breath caught in my throat, and I felt a wave of nausea wash over me. The plane was a twisted, broken shell, its metal skin blackened and charred. Pieces of the wings were scattered across the field like broken toys, and the tail section jutted out of the ground at an awkward angle. The smell of burning fuel filled the air, thick and suffocating. I could see small fires, little pockets of flame flickered and danced amid the wreckage. And then I saw them, the bodies, or what was left of them. Mangled, twisted forms lay strewn across the field, some still strapped into their seats, others flung out like discarded dolls. I could see faces, or what remained of them, frozen expressions of terror. My stomach turned, and I fought the urge to vomit. I took a step forward, my legs shaking, my mind reeling with the horror of what I was seeing. Every step felt like a step deeper into a nightmare, a vivid, grotesque scene that I couldn't escape. I moved slowly, carefully, my eyes scanning the wreckage for any sign of life, any hint that someone might still be alive. And then I saw it. A body, lying just a few feet away, partially obscured by a piece of twisted metal. My heart skipped a beat, and I felt a cold sweat break out on my forehead. I took another step closer, my breath coming in short, ragged gasps. The body was twisted, one arm bent at an unnatural angle, the clothes burned and torn. I moved closer still, my eyes locked on the face, and then I stopped, my blood turning to ice in my veins. The face was mine. I stared, my mind struggling to make sense of what I was seeing. My own face contorted in a mask of terror, my eyes wide and unseeing, my mouth open in a final, silent scream. My chest was shattered, the skin charred and blackened, the heart beneath it still and silent. I stumbled backward, my heart pounding in my ears, my mind racing. How could this be, I thought, panic flooding my senses. How could I be here looking at myself? I turned, desperate for some explanation, some sign that this was all a mistake, a hallucination, anything but the truth. But the truth was there, undeniable, staring back at me from the wreckage. I had never left that plane. I had died when it began to fall, my heart giving out from the fear and shock before the impact. Everything I had experienced since, the fall, the field, the calm, it had all been an illusion, a final, desperate trick of a dying mind clinging to life. I felt the world around me spin, the ground shifting beneath my feet. I wanted to scream, to cry, to rage against the injustice of it all, but no sound came out. I was frozen, trapped in this moment of realization, this terrible truth that I couldn't escape. As I stood there, staring at my own lifeless body, I began to hear faint whispers. They started as soft murmurs, like the rustling of leaves in the wind, but they grew louder, more distinct. I turned slowly, looking around, and I saw them, the other passengers, the ones I thought had been lost. They were standing around the wreckage, their faces pale, their eyes wide and empty. Each of them stared at their own bodies, their expressions a mix of horror, confusion, and resignation. Some were crying, others were shouting, but their voices seemed distant, like echoes from a faraway place.